Well, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I am honored to have a wonderful colleague, Dr. Botini Anagostopoulos King, who is a professor in the School of Dentistry and is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of General Dentistry over at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry. And I am excited for her to present on this, especially because a while back, we were just having a nonchalant conversation, and I mentioned how we're always looking for events, and Dr. Anagostopoulos King said that she has done work and presented on ethics. And immediately I thought that this was going to be something that is really valuable for any kind of career professional. And while Dr. Anagostopoulos King's specialty is in healthcare and dentistry, really this is applicable to any professional field and how to navigate ethical dilemmas and what kind of models you can use to apply to those situations so that way you can overcome them, you can learn from them, and you can grow as a leader and a professional. And with all of that being said, I want to give the floor to our wonderful speaker. Thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours. Dr. Anagostopoulos King.
Thank you so much, and great job pronouncing my name. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great spring break. As Greg said, my name is Botini Anagostopoulos King, and I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry. I am a general dentist. I graduated 30 years ago, which is hard to believe. I have my reunion coming up in May. And I recently received an additional postgraduate certificate in research ethics from our graduate school. So a large portion of the information I will be sharing with you today, I learned under Professor Henry Silverman, who is the chair of ethics at UMB. I direct the first and third year professionalism courses and instruct interprofessionalism in addition to clinical and preclinical dental simulations. Can everybody see our screen? Okay, so today we will lay down the foundation of ethics and ethical decision-making models. We will go over several definitions and review historical events. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to define ethics, vulnerability, paternalism, benevolent deception, ethical dilemmas, as opposed to uncertainty, distress, and weakness. We're going to review the history of ethics and genesis of informed consent. We are going to compare and contrast ethical issues to legal obligations, recognize the necessity for and value of ethical decision-making frameworks to resolve dilemmas. We are going to present a dilemma towards the end of the presentation and apply the models, the frameworks we're going to discuss to solve the case. Please note that I will rely mostly on dental sources, but the principles are the same and the models apply to all healthcare professions. These exercises do not intend to teach you what you should think about your practices. There's a common saying, don't teach students what to think, teach them how to think. We cannot discuss ethics without including history and etymology, the origin of words. We will be using the terms ethics and morality interchangeably. Being of Greek descent, I'm proud to trace its origins back to Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. First of all, who am I to teach you ethics? I do not claim to be more ethical than any of you. Part of the reason is that it is very hard to define ethics, as a definition is meant to offer a simpler, basic explanation of the topic discussed, and ethics is quite complex. Ethics is about our fundamental choices, ideas, and values. It can be described as the scholarly study of morality, what is right, fair, and good. But according to whom? Whose morality are we talking about? Who we are today, the way we see the world, is defined as our ideology, our philosophy of life, and stems from several factors such as our race, ethnicity, culture, religion, political views, socioeconomic status, family upbringing, positive and traumatic experiences, and education. But when it comes to treating patients or solving dilemmas, we identify the need to not only rely on our impulses, instincts, and emotions. Surely our feelings are important, but when confronted with a moral dilemma, we oftentimes need to take a step back, temporarily detach ourselves from the situation, and follow one or more of the ethical decision-making models we will discuss. Why are ethics and these models important? Because patients trust us and we have an obligation to live up to the trust. Ethical dilemmas frequently arise in our everyday practices and lives. We take pride in the UMB diversity. Following frameworks help in calibrating our students, faculty, and staff instead of reacting to the situation impulsively and simply basing our decisions and dilemma solutions to our culture, religion, etiquette, tradition, etc. There are consequences to our actions or lack of and decisions. And last but not least, studying ethics help us recognize, in my opinion, our shared humanity, understand each other better, coexist, and hopefully collaborate. Before reviewing the different models, I would like to go over several definitions. Let us define and discuss the 5 most fundamental ethical principles. Each healthcare profession has its own code of ethics manual. In the dental school, we have our code of conduct and principles of ethics. They're identified and described in the American Dental Association Code of Ethics. All these documents are living, breathing documents, written agreements between professionals and society, emphasizing that with privileges come certain responsibilities and obligations. Additionally, in times such as the pandemic, we are going through several public health principles become more apparent, such as reciprocity, compensating those who are quarantined, for example. Let us start with autonomy. The word originates from ancient Greek for self and law. It is the principle of self-governance, self-determination. The practitioners have a duty to respect the patient's confidentiality through patient record protection. Informed consent also falls under this principle. Paternalism is a concept related to autonomy. What is paternalism? Paternalism is defined as acting as a father. Parentalism being a more recent term, recognizing that there are actually 2 parents, usually. A provider overriding the autonomous decision of a competent patient for the patient's own benefit. The patient's value may conflict with the practitioner's recommendations, and these conflicts may lead to paternalistic decisions. When patients do not understand the consequences of their requests or have unrealistic expectations, additional patient education or explanation to a competent surrogate is needed. Additionally, patients may be treated paternalistically if they allow it to happen, if they enable it to happen, by blindly trusting a provider, by being indifferent to treatment options, by being anxious or fearful. We will now review some events that took place during the 20th century in order to justify the necessity for the genesis of the informed consent doctrine. I feel that understanding the reason it was created will assist in respecting it more and result in handling it not just as a document, but as a discussion and a process. When we said that the informed consent doctrine comes under the principle of autonomy. So first, let's go over the Tuskegee syphilis study briefly. It was carried out in Alabama from 32 to 72. It's a shameful case of medical research gone wrong. The United States Public Health Service, in trying to learn more about advanced syphilis and justify treatment programs for Blacks, withheld adequate treatment from a group of poor Black syphilitic men for 40 years. Study resulted in 28 deaths, 100 cases of disability, and 19 cases of congenital syphilis. Here are the ethical issues. Lack of informed consent. Participants were not told that treatment with penicillin in the 1940s was available. Deliberately misinformed about the need for some of the procedures, such as spinal taps described as necessary and special free treatment. Examples of the medical experiments conducted by the German physicians on concentration camp prisoners during the Second World War. The goal of these experiments was not to help the prisoners in any way, shape, or form, but to check how long German soldiers and pilots who parachuted into the cold North Sea would survive. So we have the high altitude experiments, the hypothermia, and also the malaria and typhus experiments. The hepatitis experiments at the Willowbrook State School for Children. From 1956 through 1971, residents at the Willowbrook State School for Children with mental challenges were infected with live hepatitis in order to develop a vaccine with parental permission, as it guaranteed acceptance into the already congested facility. Dr. Saul Krugman, the principal investigator, justified the study using the following reasons. Hepatitis affected virtually every child at Willowbrook due to the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. It was considered inevitable for the residents to contract the disease. Preferable for the children in the study to be infected under carefully controlled research conditions. Only children with parental informed consent were enrolled in the studies. The study had extreme value in understanding an important disease that would lead to a vaccine. So some of these points were actually valid. Additionally, many of the families did not have the means to properly care for these children. However, the study added to the stigmatization of children already vulnerable because of age and mental status. Next, we have the brief review of the Henrietta Lacks case, a Black woman diagnosed with cervical cancer whose cells were unusual in that they were immortal. They reproduced at a very high rate and could be kept alive for long periods of time. Additional HeLa samples were post-mortem at the Johns Hopkins autopsy location and used for a variety of experiments. The name HeLa, of course, is derived from the labeling method using the first two letters of the patient's first and last names. The cells were used for the creation of vaccines and also injected into cancer patients, prison inmates, and healthy individuals. They were used in AIDS research, gene mapping, cloning, cosmetics, and a plethora of other projects. In the early 70s, the decade where everything seemed to change for the better, other cell cultures became contaminated by these cells, and the family members were asked for blood sampling to learn more about genetics. We now face not only consent issues, but privacy concerns, both under the umbrella of autonomy. Neither Henrietta Lacks nor her family were asked for consent. As the cells were immortal, this is an ongoing case with suits against pharma companies. The idea of broad consent and waivers of consent come to mind, especially useful in genetics and data sharing, which can obviously include very sensitive issues and long-term studies risking stigmatization. At the end of World War II, 23 Nazi doctors and scientists were put on trial for the torture and murder of Jewish people, Roma gypsies, homosexuals, and others used as research subjects, and it was concluded that the Hippocratic Oath was insufficient at protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects. A mechanism was therefore needed whereby individuals could protect themselves from participating in research that they thought would not be in their best interest. And this mechanism is that of informed consent, a discussion, and a process, not just a document. Following meetings at the Smithsonian Institution Belmont Conference Center over a period of about 4 years, the deliberations of the commission were summarized in the Belmont Report, which provides the most important ethical guidelines for research, and we use it also in clinical medicine. Respect for persons, individuals to be treated as autonomous human beings, allowed to choose for themselves, and also provides protection, extra protection for individuals with impaired ability to decide for themselves. Elements of autonomy include decision-making capacity, the cognitive ability to understand, appreciate, and process information in order to come to a decision. Voluntariness means to be free from coercive influences and undue inducement. The Belmont Report also includes beneficence in regards to minimization of harms, maximization of benefits, and a favorable risk to benefit ratio, and justice in the sense of fairness in distribution of resources. Looking into beneficence more closely, the word originates from Latin for doing good, our duty to act for the benefit of others by reporting abuse, neglect, fostering research and development, contributing to community service, participating in the government of our profession through associations at the local, state, and national level, setting the professional demeanor at the workplace, and providing care in a timely and competent manner. Next, we have non-maleficence, the cardinal law of medicine. First and foremost, do no harm, keeping skills and knowledge current, knowing limitations, referring to specialists and seeking second opinions, delegating to your assistants the proper procedures, and refraining from engaging in personal relations with patients, all fall under this umbrella. But the question becomes, could a complete avoidance of any pain and suffering, such as injections or invasive tests in patient care, be maintained? A clinician may not always be able to avoid harm. In fact, some degree of harm may lead to greater good, restoring a patient to health. This conflict is referred to as the principle or rule of double effect. It requires the healthcare provider to consider the risks and benefits whenever treatment is provided, sometimes in such complex situations as saving the life of a pregnant woman or her fetus, and in end-of-life choices. To be morally acceptable, the clinician intends only the good effect. Consider the following hierarchy. Okay. One ought not to inflict harm, one ought to prevent harm, one ought to remove harm, one ought to do or promote good. The first classification is that of non-maleficence, which takes precedence over the second, third, and fourth, which define beneficence. This hierarchy provides the clinician with a guideline to follow in sorting out dilemmas in practice. Ideally, the clinician would be able to implement all four parts of this hierarchical relationship. However, when faced with limitations and conflict, prioritization would be necessary. Avoiding harm and promoting good in the practice of medicine are not always possible. Justice or fairness refers to serving the public fairly, not refusing to accept patient or denying services based on race, creed, gender, color, sexual orientation, gender identity, nation of origin, or disability. Fair emergency treatment, expert testimony, advertising, and marketing services fall under this category. Veracity, Latin for truth. Tell the truth regarding the representation of care, waiver of co-payment, overbilling, treatment dates, and procedure codes. Do not perform unnecessary services. Do report an adverse reaction. Do not lie when marketing or selling products or procedures. Advertising should not be false or misleading. Degrees earned and name of practice should be communicated accurately. Related to the principle of veracity is the idea of benevolent deception. Lying to a patient does not respect the autonomy of the patient and can compromise any future relationships the patient may have with healthcare providers. Benevolent deception is the name given to the practice of withholding information from a patient because of the clinician's belief that the information may be harmful to the individual. This practice is in the tradition of the Hippocratic Oath, but is not supported by most codes of ethics, and then only in extraordinary situations, circumstances such as terminal diseases. The interactive healthcare relationship between patient and clinician functions most effectively when both parties are truthful and adhere to all promises made in the process. Let us now go over examples of vulnerable people before we get to our ethical decision-making models, because that will be closely connected to our models. This definition of vulnerability is surprisingly still confusing in the 21st century. Examples of vulnerable people you will treat at the school, your practices, missions, research studies include racial minorities, the economically disadvantaged, the very sick, children, prisoners, pregnant women, healthy research volunteers, those with mental and behavioral disorders, junior members of hierarchical groups, elderly persons, those in nursing homes, people receiving welfare benefits, the unemployed, patients in emergency rooms, homeless persons, nomads, refugees, patients with incurable diseases, members of communities unfamiliar with modern medical concepts, individuals who are politically powerless, and those who take part in research while in clinical care. Definition includes internally displaced persons, orphans, the LGBTQ community, individuals with substance abuse, and others who engage in activity that is considered to be criminal by the society in which they live. The question then may be, who is not vulnerable? According to CIOMS, which is the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, in collaboration with the World Health Organization, vulnerability refers to a substantial incapacity to protect one's own interests, owing to such impediments as lack of capability to give consent, lack of alternative means of obtaining medical care, or being a junior or subordinate member of a hierarchical group as a professional student. A definition of vulnerability needs to combine two elements: the fragility of human condition that exposes us all to the possibility of harm, and the potential inability to protect ourselves. This leads to our first draft definition of being vulnerable. To be vulnerable means to be exposed to the possibility of harm while being substantially unable to protect oneself. This definition combines an internal and an external element. First, to be vulnerable, one has to be exposed to the possibility of harm, that is genuine danger, external, which is the external element of vulnerability. It does not make sense to say that the inhabitants of Germany are vulnerable to malaria. Second, to be vulnerable, one has to be substantially unable to protect oneself. This is an internal element of vulnerability. Exposure to danger alone is not what makes a person vulnerable. For instance, the intended victim of an assassination might have means to protect herself, which renders her invulnerable to the attempt. The definition needs to be refined by moving closer to the topic of ethics and including reasons for one's potential incapacity to protect oneself. Bioethicists distinguish between intrinsic and contingent reasons why some subjects might be unable to protect themselves. For instance, children and the severely mentally ill are incompetent to determine their own good. They are therefore intrinsically vulnerable to exploitation. As they cannot provide consent, one could say they lack the ability to protect themselves. By contrast, illiterate and destitute adults are competent to exercise self-determination, yet political, social, or economic circumstances make them easily victimized. They are therefore contingently vulnerable to exploitation within the clinical or research settings. An illiterate person participating in a study as her only means to access healthcare may still be able to protect herself if her social and economic circumstances changed. One could say she lacks the means to protect herself, leading to the following refined definition. To be vulnerable means to be exposed to the possibility of harm while substantially lacking ability and/or means to protect oneself. Expanding it into medicine. Remember that our first reason for studying ethics has to do with trust. Even though we use dentistry as an example, the fiduciary relationship exists across all healthcare professions. Applying and expanding vulnerability to the dental field, the inability to speak, smile, or swallow renders a person vulnerable. When a patient suffers from a toothache, cannot chew food, has an abscess, or suffers a disfiguring facial trauma, their physical and mental well-being, social functioning, and even their life may be at risk. The person needs immediate treatment and does not have the luxury to act on his own preferences or self-determination or autonomy. This state results in further vulnerability, and vulnerability in turn generates ethical obligations in healthcare providers who are not similarly vulnerable and have the expertise to care. Patients cannot treat their own abscess, toothache, or fracture filling. They depend on help from experts who they must trust. They must trust that treatment options are based on the patient's diagnosed needs and not on the provider's own interests. Additionally, they need to be comfortable that the providers are actually competent. Some may argue that with regular preventive care, abscesses and debilitating pain may become rare. In addition, many interventions have cosmetic aims and are hence elective, pointing to yet another ethical challenge. The relationship may change from a fiduciary relationship to a contractual relationship, being between a business person and a client, generating a different set of ethical principles. Let us consider a last way that the patient's vulnerability may be increased. What do we do when we want to buy something such as a car? We search ratings, talk to friends and experts, and compare prices. Yet most patients get most, if not all, of their information about treatment from one person, the provider. They may ask a few questions, seldom ask for a second opinion, and trust the doctor put their interest first. To deliberately abuse this trust for a personal gain is unethical and unacceptable. Additionally, doctors may be well-meaning but misguiding. They must be sensitive to the amount of influence exerted, as they may suppress a patient's autonomy. Doctors should not make assumptions based on cost, time, aesthetics, or function. If there are acceptable alternatives of treatments available for a patient, we should give unbiased comparisons based on the clinical evidence. A doctor who knows that the patient has limited finances and continues to treat a condition rather than referring the patient to a specialist is an example of this. Without asking and by just assuming, the doctor cannot correctly predict the value of the outcome, and the patient is unlikely to question the provider until it is too late. Information based on the doctor's interest is unacceptable. If they can make a larger profit from one form of treatment, if a student needs to fulfill a number of procedures in order to graduate, or if a research study is recruiting specific cases, the information about treatment options should be delivered accurately and without bias. Gaining consent using manipulation, deliberate or well-intentioned, is invalid, dishonest, and unethical. As stated before, a number of slides are based on my UMB postgraduate certificate in research ethics. In addition, I had the pleasure of attending the Kennedy Pellegrino Symposium at the Georgetown University for 3 consecutive years. If any of you is ever interested in bioethics, it is a great source of information, has a great library, and is a world leader in the field. We will now begin our discussion on ethical issues we're confronted with in our daily practices. What are some examples of ethical issues? Competence, referral to specialists, delegation of duties to auxiliaries, refraining from treatment, financial limitations. Does the patient have insurances or personal funds? Standard of care, conflicting treatment plans and disagreement among clinicians. Mental capacity issues such as dementia, Alzheimer's, mental illness, and other challenges. Time constraints that patients impose on us, drug-seeking patients. Harassment in the office, which is the case we're going to explore a little later, which can be racial, cultural, or sexual. Communication among clinicians, staff, and laboratory, and performing medical procedures on the wrong site. A word on ethical claims, they differ from legal, religious, and political ones, but at times they overlap. For example, killing an innocent person is both immoral and illegal, whereas dietary restrictions may be based on religious beliefs, but not ethical ones. Here are some examples of legal obligations: privacy and confidentiality, informed consent, reporting abuse, neglect, reporting impairment of a healthcare professional, and harassment. How do we usually cope with day-to-day moral issues? We may use our intuition or go with a gut feeling. We check to see how it's always been done traditionally. We check to see how others are doing the same thing. We think of practical outcomes. What will yield the most good, the most amount of good, or the most bad for us and others? We may ask a mentor, a trusted friend, an authority figure such as an expert or a teacher, or read a book or go on the internet and see if there's anything helpful there. We may rely on our religion to guide us. We may follow such moral maxim as the golden rule, referring to Matthew and Luke, do to others as you would have them do to you. Or we actually anxiously procrastinate until the decision is made for us by default. We therefore come to realize the need to come up with models to solve moral dilemmas and provide frameworks for practitioners that help recognize whether the issue is indeed a moral dilemma. State options, make a decision based on ethical principles rather than impulsive reactions or emotions, argue our point, justify our decisions, and be more comfortable with our choices. Models can be used by faculty, students, staff, and practitioners of different cultural, racial, political, religious, or socioeconomic backgrounds. First question is whether, in fact, we're dealing with a moral dilemma. There are actually 4 categories of moral problems. One is moral weakness, when you're choosing between an option that forwards an interest of yours, such as money, but violates a principle. An example is when you choose to falsify an insurance document or shade the truth to a patient, a violation of veracity, in order to make more money, enhancing your own interest. The moral dilemma is where an action you choose will often violate the principle. Principles themselves seem in conflict with each other. An example is when a friend asks you, how do you like their new haircut? You don't like it at all. If you tell the truth, you honor veracity, but violate non-maleficence at the same time by hurting their feelings. If you lie and say that the haircut looks great, you honor non-maleficence by protecting their feelings, but you violate veracity. This is a no-win situation. Moral uncertainty, when you must make a moral choice, but you're missing essential information, and you must make the decision without the needed information. For example, a patient claims that the treatment which has failed was recently performed somewhere else, but records are lost or incomplete, so you don't know the truth about when it was done. You must decide whether to redo at no cost or find some other solution, but you must do so with incomplete information. All this may escalate to moral distress when we experience frustration from a perceived inability to choose, and can be physical or psychological or both. Here is a list of models we're going to go over in detail. We're going to start with the publicity and driving home tests, the publicity being a social test. Imagine if your decision on an ethical dilemma were made public. Ask yourself what other people would think about the decision. Would you be prepared to explain your rationale? If your mother, father, partner, instructors, classmates knew about it, what would they think? How would you feel if your decision were posted on social media or printed in a newspaper? If your response to this reflection is one of embarrassment or anxiety, you may be on the wrong track. The driving home test is a conscience test. It assumes we have a conscience. In professional school and throughout your career, you often reflect on your clinical decisions at the end of the day, while driving home or at night trying to get to sleep. Did you do the right thing or the best thing? You may sense some regret of remorse or feel that something is uncomfortable about your exchange with the patient. Additional thought and analysis are necessary in order to become comfortable with your decision. That said, it does not mean that it's a right decision. Next, we have principlism. Using a simple example, keeping our promise that we will pay back money we borrow. The general principle is that we should keep our promises. A patient may ask us to not share the results of their examination with their family. privacy, confidentiality, respect of autonomy are the principles involved. Some models are based on or refer to ethical theories such as utilitarianism and deontology. So let us briefly review those terms. Utilitarianism was developed by John Stuart Mill and is the best known branch of consequentialism, the idea that the end justifies the means. Most fundamental goal is to achieve good. The amount of good is the main assessment, so it's a strict calculation. Who performs the action does not matter. Reasons or motives do not matter. What matters is the good, the amount of good, interest, which is a stake in the outcome. And examples of that interest or stake in the outcome are happiness, welfare, well-being, utility or benefit, money, time, aesthetics, the functional outcome, self-esteem, lack of pain, comfort, reputation, or graduation. Examples relevant to our times are quarantining or the mandatory vaccinations. The main ethical principle under utilitarianism is that of beneficence, doing good. But in the case of torture, where torturing one person may help save hundreds, again, whose definition of good are we talking about, are we following? Why is utilitarianism attractive? Because it's considered impartial, because it's not affiliated with a certain religion, because consequences for total human welfare matter. What is not utilitarian is human rights, the right to life, liberty, privacy, education, healthcare, and property. Next is deontology, developed by Immanuel Kant, where ethics is not a single calculation. Rules, commandments, and obligations do matter. It is followed regardless of consequences. Actions, motives, reasons do matter, and who performs the action does matter. Why is that ethical theory alluring? Because it respects autonomy. So we said utilitarianism respects beneficence and non-maleficence. Utilitarianism respects autonomy. It provides control and value. It follows common sense. It treats people with dignity and respect, not merely as a means, but as an end. One of the most practical utilitarian methods is the value maximizing method, developed by David Auger, and is designed specifically for dentistry, but again, it can be adapted to any specialties in our everyday life. Auger observes that every profession has certain values that are essential to proper practice, the central values of a practice. The values of the profession are things that every professional aspires to achieve. For example, oral health for a dentist, which makes the values of the dental profession different from the legal profession. Auger has identified 6 central values in order of importance: the overall health of the patient, the oral health of the patient's autonomy comes third, the doctor's preferences and preferred method of practicing comes fourth, aesthetics comes fifth, and judicious use of resources comes at the end. In any given patient interaction, members of the profession should aspire to produce as many of these values as possible. But all professional values are not created equally, hence the hierarchy. For example, the overall health, life or death of the patient is obviously more important than the oral health of the patient, and so on down the list. Here is how the hierarchy and theory work. Take the example where a patient desires cosmetic dentistry on periodontally unhealthy teeth. If you were to decline the patient's request, you could justify this by saying that while patient autonomy is of high value in the profession, the patient's oral health is of higher value and therefore more important in deciding what to do. A case-by-case approach to ethical decision-making takes the position that every case is so unique that applying generic principles or weighing interests using a formula will not suffice in many specific cases. A case-based method strives for a comprehensive understanding of the specifics of the case, and then a reasoned application of good judgment in deciding what specifics ought to determine a course of action. This quick and predictable approach was developed by Al Johnson. Judgment, wisdom, and experience play a strong role in all the methods presented here so far. There is no algorithm that will automatically decide what to do in every case. Law schools and business schools often use these versions of case by case in teaching. So let's use quadrant 1, medical indications. What can be done for this patient? List the technical facts of the case. What is the diagnosis? What are the possible treatment options? What are the potential benefits, risks, cost of each treatment option? What are the goals and the prognosis? This quadrant applies to the principles of beneficence and non-maleficence and is the first step to case analysis in the Johnson's four topics approach. It helps clinicians to frame available treatment options and examine how each option benefits the patient. Next, quadrant 2 is patient preference. This quadrant applies to ethical principle of autonomy and looks into previously expressed or presumed beliefs and preferences of the patient. Is the patient capable of making an informed choice? What are the patient's expressed preferences for treatment? What does the patient value? What is important to the patient? Third, quality of life. This quadrant analyzes a treatment's appropriateness in affecting a patient's quality of life and the definition as perceived by the primary team. Will there be compromises to adequate functioning? Will there be compromises in several life functions? How much pain or other suffering will the patient need to endure for the treatment to be successful, and for how long? Last quadrant, number 4, contextual features. This quadrant explores broader issues that are not covered in the other 3 quadrants of this approach. It takes into consideration factors such as economic, high caregiver burden as a result of high medical expenses, religious and cultural, family's religion and hope for miracle, confidentiality issues, and the impact of these factors on decision making. Once these questions have been adequately answered, you must weigh the relative importance of each consideration to arrive at an acceptable decision. You may look for paradigm cases that are similar to the one that confronts you and whose resolution has been generally affirmed and accepted. Then compare your case to the paradigm case to determine if there is enough similarity to decide what to do. If the specifics of your case are so unique that no other case seems to apply, you must then use your best judgment and justify your decision. As we have said, this type of judging requires sensitivity, experience, and wisdom, and consultation with others who may have more experience is essential in these situations. Certain manuals of ethics recommend 2 models for ethical decision-making when treating mentally incapacitated patients: the substituted judgment decision-making model and the best interest judgment model. They also discuss legal implications of surrogates or guardians and present a court-appointed surrogate option existing for the benefit of a patient deemed as incompetent due to cognitive limitations. In order to make such decisions, the surrogate must demonstrate competence in selecting the choice either most appropriately mirroring the patient's autonomous perspective prior to a compromised mental state, as with a substituted judgment model, or in selecting the most beneficial treatment regardless of patient disposition, as with the best interest judgment model. Sometimes these models may overlap each other in selection. Often the substituted decision-making model is found to be the most ethical. The appointed surrogate should make the decision that would help resolve the patient's problem rather than select an option financially convenient for the family. This model would be applicable in the case of a patient who suffers from late-stage Alzheimer's dementia. Historically, she always put her children before herself financially. She would opt for the least expensive treatment option for herself because she would rather spend money on her children despite their status as adults. Clinically, she has loose dentures, so a new set of dentures was recommended by the dentist. One of the prominently observed ethical pillars is in this example is autonomy. The son knows how his mother previously put her needs last and would likely be content with opting not to have the denture replaced. This way of thinking diverts some autonomy back to the mother, even though she's no longer the decision maker. However, the son might be negatively perceived by others for not choosing the most optimal treatment option for his mother, but the substituted one. Alternatively, the best interest judgment model risks his mother's potential dissatisfaction with the process of prosthodontic interventions. Additional considerations when selecting this model. One's own thoughts and decisions regarding treatment change over time as they age. According to studies, substituted judgment can have a psychological benefit to the surrogate and appeal to families, as it may remove some of the burden when it comes to making a hard decision by framing it as the patient's own choice rather than the surrogate's choice. Next, the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics model. This is, in my opinion, the most encompassing of all the models we have discussed so far. It brings everything together and goes a couple of steps further than other models, as in addition to identifying a dilemma, stakeholders, facts, it recommends consulting colleagues, malpractice lawyers, and post-operatively reflecting on the consequences. Because what we try to do is to develop protocols for the office or our life based on the outcome of our previous ethical dilemma choices and decisions. So when we want to deliberate on our decision, we have to assess if it's true, if it's accurate, if it's fair, if it's quality, if it's legal. We want to make sure we have communicated with our patient. Have we listened, or the other party, if it's not a patient setting, have we listened to them? Have we informed them of what they need to know? Have we explained outcomes and presented options? And then we have to decide if this is the best time to do what we decided, if it's within our ability or we have to refer to somebody else, if it's in the best interest of the other party, and if it's what you would want for yourself. In our school, in our third year course, we use this model, the Addison and Bistenboer. It's pretty straightforward, and we're going to use it for the most part for the case that we're going to go over shortly. So basically, we identify the ethical problem, and we want to make sure that it's a dilemma and not just a problem. We collect information and assemble facts and understand the values of the stakeholders. We state the alternatives, even alternatives that we may not choose. We usually go over 3 or more. And then we apply the 5 principles that we went over to the options, and we consider the ethical implications of each option. We choose the option that best resolves the conflicts and honors most, if not all, the principles. So let's go over a case. The patient's treatment plan consists of scaling and root planing, 2 bridges, and 6 veneers. And incidentally, this is a pretty long, pretty extensive and expensive treatment plan. He has waited for a while to have this treatment initiated due to financial considerations, but is now ready to proceed. He has referred several of his employees to the practice, and they have introduced their friends and families as well. The dentist's new hygienist has been working for 6 months in this practice. She has also referred many patients and is a great team player. She's punctual, energetic, productive, and very well liked by the patients, office manager, and assistants. The dentist has worked with several hygienists in the past, and it took a while to find someone who fit into his practice as well as this dental hygienist. One of the patient's future bridge abutments, which is an anchorage tooth for the bridge, has become symptomatic. The patient has pain in that area, and the dentist asked the hygienist to take an X-ray. After a few minutes, the hygienist asked to speak to the dentist. She's quite upset and reports that the patient made several inappropriate comments that caused her to be very uncomfortable. The hygienist even threatens to leave the practice if the dentist does not dismiss the patient. The dentist has never heard any complaints from his front desk assistants or previous hygienists. What would you do? I'm just gonna leave this on for another minute or so you can read it again. Okay, so let's apply the decision-making models. We're going to assemble the facts. We read the case and point out the main pieces of information. We have to decide, like I said, if this is just a simple problem or a real moral dilemma where ethical principles are in conflict and competition with each other. We identify the stakeholders, in this case, the patient, the provider, the hygienist, the assistant, and front desk staff members, but also the future staff members and patients, because as we said, we establish protocols that we use in the future in our life and our practices based on previous ethical decisions we have made. And we consider different points of view. So from a dental viewpoint, the patient's tooth is symptomatic. So the dentist needs to provide at least palliative treatment and referral if the decision after the discussion is to dismiss the patient. Patient needs extensive treatment and cannot be abandoned. Legally, the dentist may be sued for a patient abandonment, but he may also be sued by the hygienist if the situation is not addressed. We are all aware of the Me Too movement, and we have to take that in consideration. We can't just not do anything. Ethical standpoint. Both sides should be heard in order to honor justice. Dentists may violate the patient's beneficence and non-maleficence if they honor the dental hygienist's autonomy and vice versa. Veracity should be followed by gathering accurate information and letting patient know. Economic standpoint. Patient is ready for long-awaited and necessary expensive treatment that will help provider maintain office, pay back student loans, etc. Cultural. Just because other team members have never said anything, it does not mean it has never happened before. They may never complain because they think it's a way to keep their job, or when inappropriate comments are so frequent that they have become acceptable. What may be acceptable to one group is not necessarily appropriate to all. So what we said is that we're going to apply different options, at least three. One is to do nothing. A lot of providers would choose to not address the issue and let it just go away. It will go away by itself. They would, some of them would, would go by what their staff member said and dismiss the patient right away. Others would dismiss the hygienist because she only thinks of herself and gives an ultimatum that she's going to leave if the patient is not dismissed, where the patient is actually symptomatic. So she doesn't act as a team member. So we have three or more options, and then we take every single option when we apply all 5 principles of autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and veracity. And we find out, we start counting how many principles are honored by each option. If doing nothing does not honor any of the 5 principles, obviously it's not the right thing to do, even if it were the first thing that we would like to do, because we're not confrontational, because maybe we don't like conflict, we don't like friction. But by honoring the patient's autonomy, we violate the hygienist's beneficence and non-maleficence, and vice versa. We need to follow veracity and inform the patient of the situation. Situation certainly needs to be addressed to be fair and just to both parties in order for everyone to feel valued. The dentist, being the leader of the team, should set the demeanor of the office, should detach themselves from the situation and be impartial when gathering facts. They should not merely rely on their cultural beliefs and act impulsively, may need to consult malpractice carrier. The provider will act as a moderator in this case, in addition to being wearing different hats of medical expert, educator, therapist, business person, and other roles that we assume as providers. The documentation has to be accurate, and a solution that honors most, okay, the majority, if not all principles, should be followed. Individual discussions at first with stakeholders, apologies if possible should be expressed, attempt for another member of the team to assist in treatment, all should be taken into consideration. I'd like to thank you for listening. I know it was a lot of information, and I hope it was informative.
Thank you so much for all that information. I want to, while we're be conscious of the time, Dr. Anagastopoulos King, do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
Does anybody have questions? That may be a no, which means you've answered every question already, which is a good thing. Well, would you be able to put your email address in the chat, just so that way if anybody does want to contact you with a question, that they have your email address? And I would like to really thank you for a lot of this. This was really interesting. I think especially providing all of the examples and the models, I think that really provides people with tools and how to address these situations, whether, many of the examples were healthcare related, but I was automatically thinking in my work in higher education and engagement, many of these really would be useful for me in my career. And so I want to thank you not only for your time, but your expertise and your knowledge, and for taking today to teach us all these wonderful models, and for being a wonderful colleague and friend. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Well, I encourage everybody to contact Dr. Anagastopoulos King. And if you have a question, other than that, I hope you all have a lovely weekend. And thank you again for being here. And thank you to our presenter. I hope you all take care. Thank you again. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you. If there's anything that you would like me to do differently in the future, let me know. I like history and I like linguistics, so maybe some people are not as interested, but I feel that there has to be that foundation. You can't just jump into just talk about principles if you don't know all the meaning of the words. So if you think of anything, please let me know.
I will. Well, thank you again, and